Hello and welcome to everyone. My name is Paul Koch. I'm a research associate here in the Department of Sea Traffic and Nautical Solutions. And I will moderate this event today on the presentation of our department lead, Hans-Christoph Burmeister. He will talk on the topic of how to assess the collision risk using iWrap Mark II. Before we start, just a few important words. I kindly ask you to keep your microphone and camera offline and shut off. At the end of the presentations, if you have any questions or you want to ask something, please raise your hand and then use your microphone. Please note that since this event is recorded, that also your voice will then be in the recording. If you do not want this, you can, of course, also write an email afterwards. The chat functionality might not work, unfortunately. Okay, without further ado, the topic presented today was actually carried out a while ago. It was between 2012, 2014 in this time span. So with this, I hand over to you, Christoph, to start the presentation.
Yeah, thank you very much, Paul. I hope you can hear me and see the presentation. It's a pleasure to speak to you again. We sometimes do a little bit, CML origin stories, and that's one of the older projects which we had here. Nevertheless, still a very important issue which I would like to present. For those of you who have seen the teaser, I promised that this week is a little bit about dolphins. And I hope not too many people are disappointed now that it won't be the dolphins which we see here, but we will speak about mooring dolphins. So those are installations, as you can see them here, which you put into the riverbanks or close to the shore to moor ships while they are waiting, or also for longer times. So we have a specific use case where the idea was to install such dolphins for a certain port project that I will display you now. The second word, which maybe not everybody is aware of, is iWrap. iWrap is in principle a maritime risk assessment tool. It's internationally accepted by the IALA, which is an association of all coastal states worldwide, which is used for authorities or by authorities as a standardized quantitative method to calculate probabilities of collisions. And you specifically use them if you have changes in the traffic layout in free areas, but also in ports, to assess how certain risks are changing. And that was also the case here, which we are investigating. And as you can see, it's still a paper chart on the back end, which might give you a little bit of an indication that it's a little bit older project that we are looking at. The case which I would like to present was the offshore terminal in Bremerhaven. So Bremen and Bremerhaven are the second largest ports in Germany, and located at the river Weser, a little bit west from us here. And the idea was that within this turn of the fairway to install a further terminal for the offshore wind installation. I don't want to go into much of the discussion if the terminal, why we needed that terminal, but basically the issue was, as you can see here, the main fairway is doing more or less a 90-degree turn. And if you do changes in that areas, you have ferry traffic there, you have also pleasure boat traffic there, you have the pilot boats there, that this might result in certain changes which would affect maritime traffic. So we looked at ship-to-ship encounters, ship-to-object and grounding risks, and also encounters with the anchorage. Because what you're seeing here is that there is a certain anchorage area in that river, which is called Blackson Anchorage. For those of you who are not so aware of that, anchorage areas are basically parking spaces for ships. So you have free areas where you can go, drop your anchor and wait. And Blackson Anchorage is actually a rather important anchorage for Bremen and Bremerhaven, because I think it's the first protected anchorage once you're coming inside from the German Bait. So for smaller vessels to seek for shelter, that was an important part. At the moment, the situation there looks like that. So basically you have the main fairway where you have ship-to-ship encounters. You have the bank sites and the K-wall installations where there's of course a certain risk of grounding and object encounters if you're missing the curve, so to speak. And you have that anchorage area where there can be ships anchored or not. What is changing now, or what the plan is foreseeing, is that there was the idea to install these offshore terminal directly in the corner. And as you can see, that would narrow down the scope of the anchorage area by around 50% due to the fact that that space was needed for the offshore terminal, but also for the approach area for these vessels which go to the offshore terminal and back again. The remaining anchorage area was not big enough, or was not considered big enough, so alternatives were looked upon. And the idea was to install these line of mooring dolphins, which you can see here with 06, a little bit more upstream, to give vessels which don't find shelter on the anchorage the possibility to at least moor there and wait there until bad weather is over, or until they are called by the terminals. As you can imagine, this installation of mooring dolphins is a permanent obstacle. So of course there's a certain risk. As soon as you have permanent obstacles, it's capable to collide with them. And the idea was to assess how that would change. Now, don't worry, you might see some formulas, but I will not go into the details. But the problem statement at the end of the day is that you have a shipping lane with vessels passing by an anchorage or fixed installations. And of course, if you're not properly keeping the track, if you're drifting apart or issues like that, you have those collision risks. The good thing in this IALA iWrap model is that there's already a lot of agreed approaches how to model that. However, if we look at the anchorage, there are certain risks. You could have a collision between anchored vessels, between anchored vessels and the vessels underway, only between vessels underway while they're leaving the anchorage, or drifting issues. And the main problem that we have here is that we want to assess how the risk is changing between the vessels underway and the anchored vessels via those mooring dolphins. And this part is not included so far in the IALA iWrap model. You can, of course, model this as a fixed object. At the end of the day, you just say the anchorage is a major risk, and as soon as you hit the empty area of the anchorage, you will have a collision, and this will give you a very high number of collision candidates. I'm not going into the numbers, but collision candidates, you can imagine the higher the number, the better it is, the worse it is, sorry. So if you would model the whole anchorage, you have 540. Of course, that's not true. People of you will argue, because I would say in that anchorage, around 50% of the cases, it was not used at all. So the vessels would just pass through. If you then start to model individual vessels as fixed objects, it very much depends where I, as a modeler, put them there. And depending on where I'm putting them in the area of the anchorage, I can make you an anchorage that has a risk of 0 or also a risk of 450. And that's, of course, not really a good and objective criteria to assess changes and risk mitigation measures. So what we basically did at that point in time, and that was the time when I was still doing modeling by my own, fortunately. That was the funny part. We looked at the way how we formulated, how iWrap has formulated risks for other areas. So ship object is, of course, one kind of these thing. Basically, for those of you who are interested, it's a probability density distribution, and you look where the object is. And you have those head-on encounters. And the ship anchorage collision is somewhere in between. It's somewhere an object and somewhere it's like a head-on. So what we did is, we used those two models and combined them in a way to have a similar kind of assessment methodology as for the others, so that you can make some proper comparison. If you now look at the use case individually, you can then basically take this area, and you see here we basically have the fairway in the north, and then the orange area is the anchorage. And on the left-hand side, you basically see AIS statistics from that area. I can tell you 2012 to get AIS data was not as easy as it today. But basically, we then had the lateral distributions here, for example, of the vessels going to the North Sea, and also of the vessels who are anchored at the area. And then you can use those two to calculate, first of all, the collision risks for the anchorage, but you can also place the mooring dolphins here in between and then calculate for risk for those ones with the same input values, the risk in a comparable way, so that you have a relative assessment if the risk is increasing or not increasing. And that also helps you then to put those assessment in the overall, let's say, risk picture with all the other things that were changing there. So in terms of narrowing down traffic, larger vessels, and also other issues. The good thing is it allowed us to make a, let's say, planning approval approved way of assessing that. Of course, you see that the risk is increasing slightly. I mean, that's not a big surprise if you put a permanent installation instead of a primarily empty area into a certain port. But you also see, as we use these international agreed test methodologies and risk assessment methodologies, that even though we have an increase there in the overall risk pictures, there are, of course, other areas which were more dominant. Nevertheless, it allowed you to go in line with state-of-the-art frequency and risk assessment models, and thus it allowed you to have a fair comparison, because beforehand it was a bit like, okay, we want to change something and we're not changing apple by apple, but we are changing an apple by a pear, and how can we now ensure that this is compared and that we make, first of all, a safe design, but also a fair design in terms of investment needs and risk assessment at the end of the day. If you're interested in all those details, the reports on that are still online. Or the offshore terminal Bremerhaven itself, besides getting approved, has not been built so far. But the approval data is out there, and we also took that model further into scientific literature. If you're interested in that, there's a publication out there, which we have recently also, which I was recently also allowed to show to IALA, because they're considering to enhance that model in a way that also in future, then they can make these better assessments of anchorage areas, because that was a missing link in the maritime risk picture. With that words, I hope I more or less stayed into the 15 minutes, and hope that you're not too disappointed that it was not real dolphins, but just mooring dolphins this time. And I'm looking forward to your feedback, and hope this lunch break made you smarter than before.
Yeah, thank you very much, Christoph, for the presentation. I think it's, even after all this time, a very interesting topic. Unfortunately not been implemented yet, but maybe it will come in the future. So as I said in the beginning, if you have any questions, you may raise your hand, and feel free to open the microphone and ask the question directly. If you feel a bit shy and you don't want to do that, you can, of course, send an email afterwards, and Christoph will get in contact with you and do this maybe bilaterally. I have a question from my side, but I think this is pretty straightforward, but it's just like for more day-to-day work. Like, how easily is this transferable to a use case of maybe the same scope, but at a completely different port? Would that mean a complete new investigation, or are there parts transferable?
I think actually it's very quickly transferable. The beauty is that the iWrap model itself, that's used worldwide for different setups, for port extensions, also very often for offshore wind park planning, and if you have changes in traffic separation schemes. And there's a certain set of modeling principles in there for different kinds of encounters, and the ship anchorage encounter goes in line with the modeling principles that they already have in there. So if you're using that, you can basically integrate them there straight away. So it's a more general formula approach, which you then can specify by the geometric and AIS data characteristics which you have in your area.
Okay, yeah, I mean, that this part has to be adapted. I think that is kind of clear. Are there any more questions If that is not the case, I think we can give a small outlook to the next week, where our colleague Nico Zantop will present a interesting talk on LiDAR-based obstacle detection and path predictions for USVs. So if you're interested in that, make sure to tune in for our next MIU. Until then, I wish you a nice rest of this Friday and a calm weekend, and hopefully see you at the next MIU. Thank you very much for your attendance. Have a nice day.
Thank you very much. Also from my end. See you next week.